America, this is Democracy Now!
We ask the Pakistani government not to delay any longer in the apprehension of the main elements in this terrorist attack.
Iran's president accuses Pakistan of involvement in Sunday's suicide bombing that killed 42 people, including 6 Revolutionary Guard commanders. Other Iranian officials are blaming the United States. We'll get the latest. Then the Hispanic Caucus calls for the immediate termination of the controversial 287G program that delegates some federal immigration enforcement authority to state and local agencies. We'll host a debate. And the government of the Maldives holds a special cabinet session underwater to dramatize climate change. We'll hear from President Mohammed Nasheed.
If it was important for countries to defend Poland in the 1930s because it was a frontline state, it's very important to take care of the Maldives now because the Maldives and many other small states are in the front line of what is happening to the world, to climate today.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Iran, 6 senior commanders in the country's elite Revolutionary Guard were assassinated Sunday in a suicide bombing that killed as many as 36 others. The bombing occurred in the southeastern province of Sistan and Baluchistan near the Pakistani border. It's been described as the most serious attack against Iran in more than 20 years. The Sunni militant group Jandallah claimed responsibility for the attack. The head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard has vowed to retaliate against the United States and Britain after accusing them of backing Jandallah. Meanwhile, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad accused Pakistan of also having links to the bombers.
We ask the Pakistani government not to delay any longer in the apprehension of the main elements in this terrorist attack. And also we were informed that some security agents in Pakistan are cooperating with the main elements of this terrorist incident, and we regard it as our right to demand these criminals.
We'll have more on Iran after headlines. In other news from the region, the Pakistani military has launched a major offensive against militants in South Waziristan, the heartland of the Pakistani Taliban. Over 150,000 civilians have fled the region seeking refuge. The Obama administration had been urging Pakistan to wage the assault. General David Petraeus, the head of the U.S. Central Command, arrived in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, Sunday to consult with Pakistan's civilian and military leaders. Investigative reporter Jane Mayer of The New Yorker magazine reveals the number of U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan has risen dramatically since President Obama took office. During his first 9.5 months in office, Obama authorized as many CIA aerial attacks in Pakistan as President Bush did in his final 3 years in office. At any time, the CIA now has multiple drones flying over Pakistan, scouting for targets. Mayer writes, quote, "There is no longer any doubt that targeted killing has become official U.S. policy." David Kilcullen, a former advisor to General Petraeus, says the propaganda costs of drone attacks on civilians have been disastrously high. He recently wrote, quote, "Every one of these dead non-combatants represents an alienated family, a new revenge feud, and more recruits for a militant movement that's grown exponentially even as drone strikes have increased." The Afghan electoral crisis intensified today as Afghan election officials refused to accept findings of a UN-backed investigative panel that would force a runoff. The UN panel determined allegedly fraudulent ballots reduced President Hamid Karzai's portion of the vote to about 47%, less than the 50% threshold needed to avoid a runoff. But the Afghan Independent Election Commission, which is dominated by Karzai allies, has rejected the UN data. It's unclear what will happen if the Election Commission continues to reject the UN findings. Afghan law says the UN-backed panel is the final arbiter on complaints, but the Afghan Election Commission maintains it can contest at least parts of the investigation. The election dispute may play a critical role in the Obama administration's decision-making process on whether to send more troops to Afghanistan. John Kerry, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, addressed the issue in an interview with CNN.
It would be entirely irresponsible for the President of the United States to commit more troops to this country when we don't even have an election finished and know who the president is and what kind of government we're working with. And when our own commanding general tells us that a critical component of achieving our mission here is, in fact, good governance, and we're living with a government that we know has to change and provide it, how could the president responsibly say, oh, they asked for more? Sure, here they are. And we know that the two critical stools of counterinsurgency aren't going to stand. That would be irresponsible for a president of the United States.
The New York Times has begun publishing a 5-part series by its correspondent, David Rhodes, who was held as a hostage by the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan for 7 months. In his piece, Rhodes says that Washington's anti-terrorism policy has galvanized the Taliban. He writes, quote, commanders fixated on the deaths of Afghan, Iraqi, and Palestinian civilians in military airstrikes, as well as the American detention of Muslim prisoners who had been held for years without being charged. In economic news, the House Financial Services Committee has agreed to weaken the power of the proposed Consumer Financial Protection Agency by exempting 98% of the nation's banks from oversight by the agency. The agreement prevents the new agency from conducting annual examinations of the lending practices at more than 8,000 of the nation's 8,200 banks, leaving only the largest banks and other lenders subject to the agency's examiners. Another former Goldman Sachs executive has been tapped for a top post in the Obama administration. The Securities and Exchange Commission has named 29-year-old Adam Storch as the agency's first-ever chief operating officer of the Enforcement Division. For the past 5 years, Storch worked at Goldman Sachs, most recently as vice president in Goldman's Business Intelligence Group. Support is growing on Capitol Hill to repeal a 1945 law that exempts the health insurance industry from antitrust laws. The House Judiciary Committee plans to vote on the matter on Wednesday. The chair of the committee, John Conyers, said it does not make sense anymore to exempt the industry from federal antitrust exemption. In his weekly radio address, President Obama said lawmakers were right to review the measure.
The fact is, the insurance industry is making this last-ditch effort to stop reform, even as costs continue to rise and our healthcare dollars continue to be poured into their profits, bonuses, and administrative costs that do nothing to make us healthy, that often actually go toward figuring out how to avoid covering people. And they're earning these profits and bonuses while enjoying a privileged exception from our antitrust laws, a matter that Congress is rightfully reviewing.
In other healthcare news, White House support for the creation of a government-run public health insurance program appears to be deteriorating. Senior White House advisor Valerie Jarrett said Obama still thinks it's the best possible choice, but she admitted the president's not demanding that it be included in the final legislation considered by Congress. The former top procurement official in President Bush's administration has been sentenced to a year in prison for lying about his ties to Republican lobbyist Jack Abramoff. David Safavian was convicted in December of concealing his efforts to help Abramoff win government contracts. Safavian served as chief of staff at the General Services Administration. The UN Human Rights Council has endorsed a UN report that accused Israel of war crimes in Gaza. In a special session, 25 states endorsed the resolution. 6, including the United States, voted against it, and 11 abstained. The report by South African jurist Richard Goldstone accuses both Israel and Hamas of war crimes in Gaza, but is most critical of Israel. Around 1,400 Palestinians were killed in the Israeli attack, most of them civilians. This is U.S. Ambassador Douglas Griffiths.
The United States continues to focus our attention on our main goal, working with Israel and the Palestinian Authority to relaunch successful, permanent status negotiations as soon as possible. Resolutions like the one before us today can only exacerbate polarization and divisiveness.
A United Nations investigation into recent explosions in South Lebanon have indicated Israel had planted spy devices on Lebanese land in violation of a ceasefire agreement. It appears the spy devices were detonated by remote control from Israel after their discovery by Lebanese security forces. A first explosion was reported Saturday evening and a second on Sunday morning. No injuries were reported. If confirmed, the devices would represent violations of Security Council Resolution 1701, which halted the 2006 war in Lebanon. Meanwhile, Israel is also being accused of flying drones over Lebanon. Michael Williams, the UN Special Coordinator for Lebanon, said the use of drones is an